Good morning and hello, everyone. Welcome. My name's Amanda. I'm the designer at Ellevate, and I'm your host for today. Thank you for joining us for Power Dynamics and Equity during this year's Mobilize Women Week. It's our 5th year of hosting Mobilize Women, and we thank you so much for joining us today. For those who are new to Ellevate, we're a coalition of ambitious, supportive women and allies who show up for each other and mobilize to change the culture of business. Over the last 20 years, we've perfected the art of creating safe spaces for women to be honest about work and get validation, perspective, and actionable advice. This entire week is designed with that in mind. It's a safe space for you to share your stories and opinions, even to challenge your own perspective. Throughout the week, you'll hear from speakers from all different backgrounds who are excited to share their stories and advice with you. Please listen with intent and an open mind. Take what you hear and think about how it applies to your life. You'll have the time and space to process with others at our roundtables, mentoring meetups, and workshops. Talking some of these lessons over in a safe space is the best way to really contextualize and come up with plans of action. The more we come together to share different experiences, the more we realize we're not alone. There are other people who care and want to help you make meaningful change in the world. So before we dive into housekeeping, we'd love to thank our sponsors, especially our presenting sponsor, RBC Wealth Management. So getting into a little bit of the Zoom tips, use the chat to engage with each other and our speakers, quote the cool things that you hear to amplify the message, drop helpful links to life-changing books, websites, and apps. We're all one big community showing up, so let's get connecting. Also, post your questions in the Q&A box for the moderator to see and click the CC closed captions icon to toggle them on. If need be, you can privately message the Ellevate team. We're identifiable as host and co-host of this session and have Ellevate in our names. We're recording this session and the recording will be posted to the Ellevate site for you to watch again later. So thank you again for tuning in, and let us please welcome Erica Chung, co-founder at Ethics in Entrepreneurship, Yael Einstadt, Future of Democracy Fellow at Bergwijn, Ria Tobacco Mar, Director at ACLU's Women's Right Project, and Christy Wallace, CEO at Ellevate Network, our moderator for today.
All right, we are going to get started. Thank you all for joining us this morning. This is an incredibly important session. Why? Because we're talking about power, and we're talking about how power connects to equity, to diversity, to inclusion, and to creating a more equal and equitable world. Every single person here has some degree of power. If that's within your family, your community, your workplace, you're a business owner, a manager. There's so much we can do to think about that power, to be intentional about its use, and to be intentional about how we use that to create change. In New York City, we just had our first round of ranked choice voting. Voting is power. That's a way that we use our voice around the issues we care about. So today we're going to dive into a host of topics, from what power means in the workplace to what it means in our society. I ask you to listen with intent, to be fully engaged in this conversation, and to ask your questions so we can make sure that we're bringing this to you and that you leave here today with inspiration and with action. Please put in the Q&A any questions you might have. We want to hear them. We'll be doing Q&A at the end of the session, but also throughout if we get that. And then also, if you are posting comments, I ask, just double check. Sometimes you post just to the panelists, but we want to hear what you have to say with the entire community. So you can post to panelists and all attendees, or just panelists. If you want all attendees to see, make sure that that's where you're sharing your remarks. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm Christy Wallace. I'm the CEO of Ellevate Network, and it has been an honor to bring Mobilize Women Week to you this week. We close out tomorrow with some more sessions around building a racially reconciled future. We have a host of roundtables today and tomorrow, so please continue to be engaged with these discussions. We want to make the safe space to bring them further and to make them relatable to you. I'm going to start off today's session asking our amazing panel to do a little bit of background on their work and their impact on this world. So I'm going to first ask Erica if you could share a bit about yourself with our audience today.
All right, thanks, Christy, for that introduction, and thanks everyone for being here today. So today, in the context of power and equity, a big reason why I had sort of approached this topic is I was a whistleblower in a large healthcare scandal. So I had whistleblown on a company called Theranos that was a medical diagnostic company that raised about $700 million at a $9 billion valuation. And they were essentially using faulty technology to actively test on patients. And to give people context about what whistleblowers is, to sort of set the stage, there are people who are whistleblowers for regulators, for the government, internally within a company, if they're experiencing discrimination and they want to file a suit against their employer. And in my story and my background, I was considered a regulatory and a media whistleblower. And now I am working on a nonprofit where essentially we're trying to figure out how do we embed conversations of ethics and ethical questioning and culture and systems into new ventures. So when we think about resolving some of these big ethical issues that arise within the business world, how does that actually get operationalized and solved in the context of building new innovations and new companies? So with that, I'll turn it over to Christy.
Thank you, Erica. Ria, do you want to go next?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ria Tabakamar. As Christy shared, I'm the director of the ACLU's Women's Rights Project. I'm based here in Brooklyn, and so I'm particularly impressed by all of you who are tuning in from earlier time zones. So thank you for joining us with your coffee, and I'm certainly still drinking mine. I really have devoted my career, I think, to sort of trying to dismantle systems of power and equity. So just by way of background, I started my career at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where I focused primarily on employment and housing discrimination cases. But one of the things that was actually a side project for me during my years at the Legal Defense Fund, and this is dating me to some extent, but this is right when cases were beginning to be filed seeking marriage equality for same-sex couples and challenging the Defense of Marriage Act. And we at the Legal Defense Fund decided to participate in those cases, trying to draw historical parallels between arguments that were being advanced to oppose marriage for same-sex couples, and really showing they were the same arguments that had been advanced and rejected in the context of bans for unmarriage for interracial couples. So this notion that our marriages are somehow unnatural or inferior, that they're harmful to children, all of those were the same arguments that had been raised and rejected in the prior context. And this was really exciting work for us to be doing. This was before President Obama had expressed his support for marriage equality, and we were really proud to be a traditional civil rights organization supporting marriage equality in that way. And through that work, I got to know many of the ACLU lawyers who were actually litigating those cases. And so when the team doing the LGBT rights work was expanding, they invited me to come join them. And I litigated LGBT rights cases for about 5 years before becoming the director of the ACLU's Women's Rights Project. So my career, I think, really is a testament to the through lines between and across different civil rights movements, all of them in some ways at very different stages of development and at the same time facing many of the same challenges. So I'm really excited to talk about some of that with all of you today.
Thank you so much. And Yael, would love to hear a little bit more about you as well.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to share this conversation with Ria and Erica. I think we each bring a different perspective and different background, and I know mine is particularly different, but it sounds like we all have a similar North Star. So I'm really excited for this. I began my career in a very strange place for someone who sort of embodies what I do. I started as a CIA officer in a sort of pre-September 11th world, worked a lot on just sort of global policy issues, trying to figure out where the US fits in the world in a post-Cold War world and how we can sort of build better bridges. I worked a lot, mostly in Africa. That was for the first few years, and I became a diplomat, which was more suited to me, to be frank. And sort of the through line that ends up where I am now is I spent a few years in East Africa, heading a lot of what one might call sort of hearts and minds work and engaging with communities in particularly marginalized areas. And I know hearts and minds is a very controversial terminology, but it was really just about listening and understanding other cultures and other people and figuring out how we could find common ground and work together better for shared challenges. Fast forward, came back to Washington, worked at the White House for then Vice President Biden as one of his advisors, and then left government in 2013, really as a challenge to myself to see how the private sector affected some of these global challenges that I had worked on in government. Ended up doing a variety of odd things. The one I'm more known for, although it was the smallest part of my career, was I started about 5 or 6 years ago. I never planned to speak publicly, never planned to say CIA publicly, but I started seeing what was happening in the US and it started terrifying me. And I thought we were a bigger threat to ourselves than any foreign adversary, and started talking about it, started digging in on what was radicalizing us, which ended up getting Facebook to call me. One could claim they called a critic to see if they could hire a critic. Sorry, this is going on too long. So Facebook hired me to head its elections integrity work. I was very clear with them. I will only come here if X, Y, and Z. And the biggest question was if you actually have support for someone like me to work here. And they didn't. So I left in under 6 months and have spent the last few years both screaming from the mountaintops about what was happening to our democracy and working to ensure we had an election and working to try to protect our democracy. So sorry, that ended up being a longer story than I meant, but I'm excited to dig into all of these things with you guys.
That was not a long story because I think every one of us is just wowed by the work that all three of you are doing about across the spectrum as we think about power and equity, from politics and government to civil rights and corporations we work for every day. What does that mean? How does that translate to our own lives, and how do we learn from the wealth of knowledge and experience and impact that each of you have had? So I wanted to start with Erica, and I want to dig in a little bit deeper into this, your role as a whistleblower, because so many of us work in companies or we're in places where we want to speak up, where we want to use our voice and our values to create change. But oftentimes there's concern about the impact of that. So what has been your experience coming out as a whistleblower, and has that experience been different as a woman in the workplace versus some of your male colleagues?
Yeah, I think the notion even of coming out as a whistleblower is really interesting, because I think for a majority of people who are whistleblowers never really thought that that's what they were doing. And it wasn't until the media really starts calling you a whistleblower that you sort of get coined that term. Most of the time, people who decide to speak up, they're doing their job, or they're doing it in the guise of trying to solve a problem or trying to prevent a disaster from happening. It's been really interesting kind of in my own personal journey of being sort of coined as a whistleblower, because in my mind, it was just to do my job, basically, and to help protect patients and to provide them with quality care. That was kind of the bottom line of what was going on. I think in terms of the peculiarities of being a woman and looking at other female whistleblowers, I think in the context of our case, so there was a small group of us that had essentially reported to the media, and there are different people who were able to go on the record about whistleblowing versus other people who weren't. And in my case, I never wanted to be on the record actually as a whistleblower, but because I had gotten subpoenaed for a court case, the judge released those records in that document. And so I woke up one morning and my name was in the SF Chronicle, and all these people from San Francisco were contacting me, letting me know that I had now gone on the record. I think, in my position, I wasn't coming from a background where I had the financial resources to understand what it would mean in terms of the legal protections I would need in whistleblowing. And then also, I think for a lot of women, the personal protections of, am I going to be safe in the context of going against a company that is well known to have an immensely powerful backing, and both on the financial side, on the resource side, and everything, what does that mean for my personal safety? And when you look at a lot of female whistleblowers, they tend to do it in groups, probably because there's strength in numbers. There's strength in a group of people coming together and actually reporting versus that there's been a lot of research to show with male whistleblowers, they may actually just do it independently. And I think these are things that people need to consider, right? That it is, I think, for women specifically, a big issue of, am I personally going to be safe? That threat is more omnipresent amongst women. And there are interesting platforms that are starting in certain spaces for this. Callisto is a good example, where essentially if a woman experiences a sexual assault with a particular person and she doesn't want to go in it alone, she can flag that in a database, and any other women who experience the same thing can all go in to sort of fight up against other people. And this has been a successful model, but I think it's a testament to this fact of women just generally feel a little more reticent to come up against these very powerful figures, because it is the case that we do have to worry, probably many of us, on a daily basis of our personal safety, I think more so than our male counterparts.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you for that work and for sharing that with us. Yeah, I know a lot of what you do and your passion, your impact has been on the front lines over the past 15 months. You know, you're mobilizing others to really question some of the power dynamics in our society and in government and in tech and in the world. What are some of the biggest lessons that you've learned and takeaways from this time?
No, I want to pick up a bit on what Erica said. First of all, just so much respect for Erica's story. I think it's really easy for me to give off platitudes like speak your truth and stand up for what you believe in and challenge, power. But the reality is it's not as easy as it sounds. And B, we don't all come from the same place of comfort to be able to do that. And comfort might be the wrong word, but it's a lot of, so I have never called myself a whistleblower. Unfortunately, the media has. I am not, because I had already left the company, and I have always been, which is funny considering I've worked in some very secret spaces. I am just brutally honest and forthcoming about what I think, including challenging big people. So the two times that I again, never planned to say CIA. I just want to start with like where that suddenly went from always behind the scenes and had my whole social life and no one really knew my past to, oh my gosh, I'm all over the place. Not to get too political, but it started with the 2016 election. And on day one, some of you might remember that the very first thing, well, I'm out at the Women's March, I'm having an optimistic moment for the first time in quite a while. And I get home and find out that the then president had just gone to the CIA and done this speech in front of the Wall of Stars. And I watched the speech, and everything about the speech was just, for those of you who remember, there were so many things in it that just was the hugest warning sign of what was to come. And that night, I never thought I would be somebody who sounds like they're defending the CIA. It was, there's a lot of twisted things your brain has to go through to be able to suddenly go public with any sort of thought. But I wrote this op-ed in the New York Times about his speech and about the star on the wall behind him that was my dead former colleague, and about what this sort of autocratic speech meant for the future of our democracy. And so again, not trying to get overly political, but I went in a split moment to the whole world knowing who I was, knowing my biggest secret that I had held for 17 years. Like, think about it, ex-boyfriends suddenly are like, oh, she was in the CIA. I think it was everybody. And I only bring up that whole story because I did it not, here's what some people don't realize. Yes, there are many people who love to speak publicly, because it's what they need to do for work, or it's how they need to self-promote, or it's how they need to make money. I have no doubt that what Erica did was not about any of those things, because she was taking a huge risk, speaking up against a powerful company that could affect her future employment opportunities as well. And me speaking up in this way never led to any great financial success. It led to like, oh my gosh, she's so brave, but we also know she will speak her mind. So we all want to talk to her, but we don't necessarily want her having a seat at the table, because she might speak out against us in the future too. So that was sort of the circular story, but same thing with Facebook. I mean, when I left Facebook for 6 months, I wouldn't speak, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew I had very, very strong things to say that would actually hurt what Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg were saying and doing. And I had to choose the right moment to do that. And it has to be when you know, I was actually, this is a company that could come after me in a way that almost, I don't know that any other company could. They know everything about me. So I just want to say it's not an easy thing, right? But for me, I have always been more sort of community focused, public servant at heart. What I couldn't be silent when I did fundamentally believe this company was undermining our democracy, and if not held to task, would do it again in 2020. And so to me, that was bigger and more important than myself. But people, I would always caution people, you should absolutely find a way to speak up when you need to speak up. But seeking counsel of other women, other friends, important people in your lives to just, understanding that it's hard. I lost all my income. I lost my apartment. Like, I didn't have a safety net. Not everybody is doing it in a super comfortable situation. And for people who are, just imagine, I'm privileged. I'm going to be frank. I'm a white woman who knows that I have a supportive family, who knows that the community will see me in certain ways. Imagine people who are way more marginalized than me speaking out against power. Like, I just want people to hold on to the idea that nobody is minimizing how hard that is and how the tough choices we face, including how that affects your future employment. But I do think it's really important to just find support of your community. I did not consult with very many people. I've always just spoken my mind, and the whirlwind of what happened to me after all of that has been a lot to navigate. So lessons learned, sorry, that was again all over the place, but lessons learned are just, yes, you have to be brave, you have to be strong, you have to do what you think is right, but it's also important to seek support from your community, because that does, I'm sure Erica can attest, it takes you down a whole nother whirlwind of public attacks. I still to this day get messages I will not repeat here because they are so violent and so vile, but I don't regret a single second of it, because I will be able to go the rest of my life knowing that I stood up for what I believed in.
I just want to pause for a moment and acknowledge and make space for all of that. Thank you for your honesty and your vulnerability. And yeah, having a space in a community, that's why we do what we do every day at Ellevate, is to make these safe spaces and people that have your back and support you and will lift you up, because this is a difficult journey. There are so many challenges when you talk about power and who has power and who wants to cling to power, and then how we leverage our own personal power to create change. And so thank you so much for the work that you've done and for sharing that with us. Ria, you've been fighting for this community and for all women. You penned women's rights to-do list for the Biden administration. 6 months in, what progress are you seeing? And how are we seeing a shift in power towards something that really creates more equity for all of us here today?
That's a great question, Christy. And before responding, I did also just want to acknowledge the bravery of Erica and Yael, and just my own sense of being humbled. I, unlike them, my job is to represent people like Erica and Yael. So it's our clients who are the brave ones, not us, the attorneys who stand behind them. And I certainly have represented people whose cases landed them on the front page of the newspaper and led them to receive death threats at their homes. And it is a very, very brave thing. Most of our clients, stand to gain nothing financially, and they obviously risk a tremendous amount, but they do it precisely because of what Yael said. It's because of the person coming behind them, so that no one else will have to experience the discrimination that they experienced. And it's just such a tremendous honor and privilege to represent people who demonstrate that bravery, like the amazing women on the panel with me today. But on a more positive note, how are we doing 6 months in? We have to take a step back and think about where we were in December of 2020 when I wrote this list for the Biden administration, because we were coming on the heels of really the most anti-woman presidency in modern history. When you think about President Trump, many of his sort of most high-profile misogynistic actions were, comments, his famous grab him by the pussy. He was credibly accused of sexual assault by more than 24 women. He called E. Jean Carroll a liar for accusing him of rape. He then tried to have the Justice Department represent him in that lawsuit, claiming that he was just doing his job as president when he lied about raping her. So these are really, really shocking comments that I think got a lot of attention. What may have gotten less attention is the fact that all of that misogyny was actually carried out in various official policies rolled out over the course of 4 years. And that is something that took us 4 years to get into this mess, and it's going to take us more than 6 months to get out of it. And so as much as I want the Biden administration to pick up the pace, I also have to acknowledge the enormity of the task that they've inherited. And step one is just going to be really undoing some of the damage. So just to name a couple of examples, just last week, we got news that the Biden administration undid the Trump policy, which banned women who are experiencing domestic violence from seeking asylum in this country on that basis, right? What a devastating decision that had been from the Trump administration. What a huge relief it is that Biden has undone it. But again, we're just bringing ourselves back to where we were 4 years ago. We have not yet really, in seriousness, begun the product of advancing. Another example, one of the ways that Trump really implemented his anti-woman policy was through Title IX regulations issued by then Education Secretary Betsy DeVos concerning campus sexual assault. This was, these were very controversial. And for us at the ACLU, we felt that, in one respect, the regulation was an important advance because it codified for the first time important protections for students who face disciplinary action by schools. At the same time, it rolled the clock back in terms of protections for survivors of sexual assault and harassment. And it subjected those reports to a second-class status that students who experience other kinds of assault or harassment based on race or national origin or religion are not subject to, right? Really calling out what some people call sort of a pink code or pink courts, this idea that when women report sexual violence, it is, we should be skeptical, that it should not be believed in the same terms that other reports should be believed, right? These are notions that have very, very deep origins in our law, and we think we have moved past them, and then we see efforts like this by DeVos to actually re-enshrine them in American law. Good news, right? Biden has already announced that he will undo the rule, right? Bad news, we don't know yet what's going to come to replace it. And whether, again, it will take us back to where we were in 2016, or whether we can really see meaningful advances for survivors and for all students on campus who are on both sides of these disciplinary proceedings. It took the Trump administration 2 years and 2,000 pages to come up with their plan for Title IX. And so I think we have to be realistic about the amount of time it may take the Biden administration to come up with an appropriate replacement. So these are just a couple of examples, but I think they really demonstrate the enormity of the task. How can we not just, restore ourselves to where we were in 2016, but how can we move beyond that, armed with the knowledge that we now have? I don't want to say post-pandemic, but at this stage of the pandemic, maybe is more accurate, at this stage of the pandemic, where we've seen, the disproportionate effects on women, the most unequal recession in modern American history. We've seen how vulnerable women's gains are in the workplace and the housing market. and schools. And so what can we do with this knowledge to demand, not just where we were 4 years ago, but how can we actually use this knowledge to demand more and better? And that is a task, I think, that is really, really just beginning 6 months into the Biden administration.
Thank you so much for that, Ria. And as you're talking, and I'm sure many of those joining us today are impacted by what you're sharing, because for me, at the core, this is about human rights. This is around valuing humans equally, providing equal protection, really thinking about how we as a society come together to support one another. And yet we live in this time that feels so polarized. It feels like we're constantly having to have discussions around why Black Lives Matter and why sexual assault on campus is not okay. And, someone's a swimmer and they have a future. Why should we, punish them for their crimes? I mean, it goes on and on and on. So how do we sort of come together to this middle ground? And I don't, I struggle saying that, because it shouldn't be a middle ground. It should be, okay, we all should have equal access to rights. But, many of us on the call today have had to have these discussions in our communities and in our families. So do you have advice on, how we bridge this gap and move forward?
That's a great question. And, in some sense, it's not just a gap, it's this sense that women's rights are tired, or that gender justice is boring. I say that to you because, last year, for example, we saw Virginia become the 38th state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, a question that's still being litigated. But, in the wake of that ratification, we saw, dozens of think pieces. I'm a feminist. Here's why we don't need the ERA. I'm a whoever, here's why we don't need it, because we almost think it doesn't need to be said, here's why we need the ERA. And I think what the pandemic has shown us is, no, actually, we do still need to talk about, right? Here's why we need protections from sex discrimination. Here's what the reality of gender discrimination looks like today. It is a real problem. This is not something of the past. But there's a real wariness, I think, in the media and the public discourse around acknowledging that this form of discrimination is something that we're still facing. Again, not just in a Me Too context, or not just in a 21st century context, but in the same context that we have been facing it for centuries. And that is not something that people want to hear, but it's something that needs to be said, and it's something that we all need to be out there trumpeting. What can we do about it? There are some bipartisan measures that give us hope. So just to call out a couple, one is the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. This is something that would update the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978 to ensure that no one has to choose between a healthy pregnancy and a paycheck. We have bipartisan support for this bill. We have support from the Chamber of Commerce for this bill. I truly believe that we can pass it in 2021, but more importantly, none of you here who are coming from the corporate context need to wait for the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act to become law to treat pregnant workers fairly. And that's a message I think is so important for this audience, right? We don't have to wait for the Equal Rights Amendment. We don't have to wait for the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. We don't have to wait for the Biden administration to undo many of the Trump rules. We can start doing the right thing today, right here and right now. And that's something I want everyone in this call to walk away with, right? The knowledge that we can begin modeling best practices at home before anyone has told us that we have to. And by the way, I do think this administration is going to tell us that we have to sooner rather than later. But we don't have to wait. We can model good behavior, and we can be out there making sure that our internal practices align with our external vision for the world.
Yes, we do not have to wait. Everyone, take that away with you today. Yeah, power is, or information is power. And in a time where we're inundated with information, the way we get information, the way information is validated or invalid fake news. I mean, we just live in a time where I think about this a lot. I have 3 children. My son, who was 11 at the time, knew Trump had COVID before I did. His friends are sharing stuff. They're seeing it online. Where are we going? Where does information that equates to power and knowledge to impact and change, where do you see the future of what has happened during this time, and where we go from here?
That's a big question. I think we could go in multiple directions. There's the pessimistic direction and the optimistic direction, perhaps. But it's why I keep fighting this fight. I won't give the entire information ecosystem talk here. I've given it many times before, and I want to really focus on like what we as women can do. But without question, something has to change in the way we consume our information, in the way we engage with information, how we get to a point where truth and facts matter and what is a truth and a fact. And all of those issues are huge and unresolved. This is why I keep fighting every day for some sort of accountability for how the gatekeepers of our information, where their role lies and responsibility for how they are affecting how we engage. But I'm not going to go into that whole speech here because that's a long one. But I mean, I think there's multiple things, right? First and foremost, what brought me into the world of eventually ending up at Facebook and then becoming a very big critic is that I was hearkening back to a time where I was like, my job in East Africa was again about here. Let's just paint a picture. Here I was, a single, at the time, young Jewish female civilian with a Hebrew name, going off with no real marching orders to like these marginalized communities along the Somalia border that in every single way were as opposite for me as possible. And just sitting down, and what I immediately learned was the most powerful thing I could do was sit and listen. Listen to what people are saying, what people need, what people distrust about us. And then once you listen, figure out how you can start building trust. That is very difficult today because the power of social media and the power of our online world is built currently not to help us listen. It's built to help us react quickly with emotion as opposed to taking a step back, absorbing, listening, processing, and then engaging. So it's difficult, and we need to push ourselves to figure out how can we. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have really lost sight of is how can we engage with people who aren't like-minded. It does not mean that I want to go sit down with a member of the Proud Boys and try to change his mind. That is not what it necessarily means. But we're losing that. We're self-segregating as well, right? Into more and more like-minded communities, especially the more we are online now. It is very easy to listen. I live in this place called Stuytown in Manhattan. I am in this great little bubble of people who think like me, who share similar values. And that has never been my world. I've always been in the opposite. And I have a choice. I could push myself to, we don't meet around water coolers anymore, right? We don't meet people who aren't somehow very similar to us. And if we have any hope of getting through what I still believe is a huge challenge to our future as a democracy, we have to be able to figure out how to engage on a human level with people who are not like-minded, not necessarily to change anybody's mind, but to remind people that at the other end of this argument, we are a human being. Because when people understand your human sort of aspect behind things, it is much easier. Like if you want to sit down with somebody who is vehemently opposed to, I don't know, to trans rights, sitting down and trying to go through a bullet point of all the reasons they're wrong is going to be a lot less powerful than sitting down and trying to connect emotionally with why this may affect you or someone you love or someone you know. And that's very hard in today's world. I don't have the perfect answer of how we're going to do that, but it is something I think as individuals, we really need to push ourselves to do. And then the second point, pivoting a little bit, the thing that I'm really thinking about a lot right now is whose voices we're elevating and whose voices are influencing a lot of the conversations. You know, this woman, I always reference back to this. This woman wrote this piece. I mean, she is a friend of mine. I didn't know her as well when she wrote the piece in the Washington Post, and I'm happy to plug it in the chat, about the Cassandras of the last decade. And the title's a little unfortunate. It's something like "The Decade Sucked, Women Told You It Would." Get past the title. And she just goes woman after woman after woman who took risks, who really ring the alarm bells of some of the biggest threats going on right now. And those women aren't always the ones who then are the ones who also get to help enact the change. They're taking risks, they're the Cassandras, but at the end of the day, I mean, I assume Erica can be considered a Cassandra, and so can Ria, and I know I am as well. But when the broader community is finally aware of like any issue, let's take Ria's issue about pregnancy rights. I am sure it is Cassandras who are screaming about why it's important. And once the public finally grasps that it's important, do those same women get called upon to help lead that change? Or do their voices now get co-opted by someone who realizes this is important, and so now they're the ones who are going to lead this effort? And it's just an important, it's a power dynamic I've been thinking a lot about lately. Whose voices get to be part of the actual discussion of change? And is it those same voices who are the ones who helped make the public even aware of the issue to begin with? Because the people who take the biggest risks are not often the people who then actually get the job, get the actual role to come in and make that change. And it's a dynamic that I would love to figure out. I don't have an answer to, but I would love to figure out how to shift that dynamic. I'm going to plop the piece into the chat because I think it's a really interesting one. And it goes to the idea of power, right? Erica took a huge risk, stood up, highlighted an issue that was happening. Many of us have seen the movie now. We know what a huge deal, what was going on at Theranos. But when talking about how to maybe legislate some of that bad corporate behavior, or at the corporate boardroom, trying to make sure a company doesn't reenact that same issue, is Erica the one that they ask, will you be a member of our board? Does that make sense? Do you take the person who took the risk and also help them be part of the change moving forward?
That makes absolute sense. And it's something, that happens in small ways every day, where, someone might come up with an idea in a meeting, and then, typically a man will take that idea and make it their own and run with it and get the credit for it. And and of course, in this discussion today, it's a much bigger way. But yeah, it's how do we change this every day around really acknowledging those that are putting in the work and taking the risk and fighting for this change? Erica, I would love to turn it over to you. I mean, I don't know if you have comments.
Yeah, I had a quick comment because I noticed a lot in the chat, a lot of people talking about, people have or desire to take a personal risk, but then there's a bit of fear that comes along with that. Like, how do I know who to trust? How do I know that I'm going to be safe? How do I know that anything's going to be done once I have a concern, once I'm trying to identify that there's something that I deeply desire to change? Whether that's preventing discrimination in the workplace, whether that's providing equal rights for women, how do I go about that, and how do I sort of structure myself? So I think to sort of touch upon, how do you figure out who to trust when you go on your own journey? I think we've talked a lot about the adversaries. We're all going through, we're all up against these huge adversaries, but coming back to, we also have an immense amount of allies. Ria's work, Yael's work is sort of a testament to that there are lots of people that can join you along your way to help you move through some of these difficult circumstances and situations. So one of the things that I think I learned from whistleblowing is that there are a lot of systems of checks and balances that you can turn to. I was in a position where it's like, broke and lawyers go together like oil and water, but it just wasn't something that I really thought I could turn to. But there are great organizations like the ACLU, like the Signals Network. These lawyers will work on contingency and at least meet with you for a introductory conversation to give you the resources that you need to resolve the issues that you have. That is a resource you can turn to. Building effective support networks. Everyone knows that there's one other person that probably shares the same concerns as them, and to just start talking to them about the fact that, hey, we have this particular issue. I want to do something about it. I think this is the change that I would like to see happen. Do you think there's anyone I could talk to, if not you yourself? Because there is sort of strength in numbers and in being able to sort of resolve what are potential solutions to kind of move forward. Also getting to a better place of sort of trusting yourself. Power is something that we definitely give to other people, but it's also something that we can give to ourselves and understand that we do have the ability to sort of make it through tackling some of these challenges, and that there are other people sort of fighting the good fight, and to not lose sight of that, especially when it can become so overwhelming with the sheer number of problems that we have. In that, asking really thorough questions, it is free, it's cheap, and it'll give you really good insights on what someone's about, what they're actually doing. Do they have and seem to have alignments with the mission that you're seeking and the values that you have, to kind of push through and move forward, whatever personal challenge that you're going through or trying to figure out. I just wanted to add that as a sort of loop around, Christy, for the initial talk that we were talking about.
I mean, it's incredibly important, because as we talk about power, it's, I think we can think of it as individual. And in many of your instances, you are an individual who is leveraging your power to create change. But yet it is very community based too. We need support, we need collective voice. Like, how do we come together and know who to trust? But also, Erica, I think the question goes further as well, because we live in a time, particularly where we're talking about these dynamic leaders who have a vision, who are charismatic, who can easily, get us all to buy into that vision. We saw that with Theranos, but we see it with a number of companies today. And when you start to kind of see the cracks in those, big moonshot ideas and the passion around that, where does that lead us? What are the questions you ask yourself to say, okay, hold up, like this isn't the vision I seek, and finding that space to then really have that courage to stand up and speak out.
Yeah, this is always a really tough thing, because I think having a mission and a vision is really crucial and really important, and to strive for things that are outside of the scope of what we anticipate. Like, we all know how motivating of a force that could be. If you are trying to mobilize people to do things and you're saying, oh, we're going to build electric batteries that are better than any other electric battery, that's way less appealing than, say, joining a mission to say, hey, we are going to, basically fight up against climate change by not having any carbon emissions for the cars that we drive. So there's some value in that. And I think all of us can sort of sense that there's value in having a mission, for striving for big things that aren't in existence. And I don't think we're ever going to be able to take away from that, nor do I think we should, right? There's lots of things that we should aspire higher to. I think what we're talking about here is, what starts to happen when there is a conflict, right? And there's a direct issue where the things that people are saying and aspiring to either comes in direct conflict with itself, or it comes in direct conflict with people's actions, and that there's this sort of misalignment between what people are saying and what people are doing. And this, I think, is the source of a lot of friction in our society right now, where people are really upset because people are not necessarily putting their money where their mouth is. They're saying that they're trying to stand up for different societal issues, whether that's climate change or whether that's reducing, preventing discrimination in the workplace, but we're not actually seeing those actions align with the ideals that people are setting forth. So I think, in terms of that, there's a couple things in terms of the organizations that we're a part of, understanding, okay, are we actually in reality doing the things that we said we are going to do? And do we have receipts that are able to sort of back that up? And if we are not, what are we going to do in order to change that? And that's a big priority that I think needs to be at the leadership of a lot of these organizations. I think on a personal level, if you do start to see these companies that are acting in misalignment with their values, and particularly in the realm of misconduct, they're harming people, right? They're causing whether issues internally within their organization or externally. What are the systems of checks and balances that we can leverage to sort of reorganize the power dynamics? When is it the situation that someone has been given too much power and it's sort of been unbridled? And this is where, the support of our legal infrastructure becomes really important. Ideally, an organization has reporting infrastructure internally in there that you can do that in a safe manner. There are policies to protect you, whether that's a whistleblower policy or an HR department that's able to be an ally to you amongst those investigations. There's the regulatory support, which still needs developing depending on what type of misconduct it is, especially for private companies. There's not a lot of protections for people who work within private companies. And then there's going to the media, right? I think, on one side, it's a bit scary, the fact that the media is going the direction that it's going, but it's also empowered a lot of individuals to be able to have a voice and have transparency in the organizations that they're a part of more than ever before, right? They are able to sort of show people the reality of what's going on, the actual behaviors that people are engaging in a way that's never been done before, because it hasn't been so easy for people to sort of showcase what's kind of going on internally within a company. I think another thing I see in the comments here is, boards are usually leveraged to help act as a system of checks and balances for an organization. I think this is really important if you're a leader of an organization. Do you have a board that's actually going to hold you accountable and ask you the right questions? And is it the case that you're prepared as a leader that when they come up and ask you these questions, that might become a direct threat to your position? And you really have to sort of grapple with the fact that there may be a case that you yourself are engaging in a certain behavior that's at detriment to your own organization or to the stakeholders that interact with your organization. And have you reconciled that, and do you understand that? And I think on the board level, people taking these board seats have to understand that there's a certain responsibility that they sign up for in holding an organization accountable, and that's actually their role. That it's not the case that this is sort of a position where you can kind of throw it on your resume, or it's sort of fun for you to do. That there's a certain level of responsibility there. And with that all, I think I also started to go and veer into tangents, but I'll pass it back over to Christy.
I mean, it just goes to show how important but yet nuanced this conversation is, right? Because across the entire spectrum, as we talk about power, from an individual to a leader to a citizen, a politician, and beyond, there's an entire matrix, an ecosystem around not just those that have power, but what we do with it, and then how we wield it, and how we get that support and amplification of voice. And Ria, I would love to hear from you on this, specifically as we have gone through, I'm saying a year, but that's minimizing it because these have always been issues and human rights issues that have been important. We've talked about mass incarceration, we've talked about racism, we've talked about women in the workplace and beyond. What are the ways that each of us individually wield our power to create change as humans who want to really see power lead to greater equity and equality in this world?
If I had all the answers for that, I think we probably wouldn't need today's session whatsoever, but I really do want to pick up on the thread of something I said earlier, and also that I think Erica really amplified about, we talked about what corporations can do now to start aligning their internal policies with the external values they're putting out in the world. And each of us, in some sense, is our own corporation, right? And we all have the ability to make our own personal choices and to live our lives consistent with our values. So, for example, do you think integration is important? Look at where do you live? Where do you work? Where have you chosen to send your children to school, right? What can you do in your own choices to make the world look like the place that you say you want it to be? And if you haven't made those choices consistent with your external values, then that's really an opportunity for introspection to say, what is it that's holding me back? Is it a perceived conflict between what's best for me and what's best for other people? And if there is that conflict, then I really, I challenge you to ask yourself, do I think integration is good for other people but not me? Or do I truly believe that, integration and diversity will benefit everyone, including my own family and including my own children? Because those are the decisions where we see the rubber really hit the road and where people really struggle, I think, to live up to their values. And on some level, I think it should cause us to question whether these beliefs truly are deeply held. And if they're not, why not? And what can we do to better educate ourselves so that we're in a position to vote with our feet and to begin living our lives in the way that we think other people should be. And also to recognize that we will make mistakes along the way. We will not always be successful. I think there are I'm on the panel with some very successful women, and I think that can be intimidating because when people see a problem in the world or they experience discrimination, they call it out. Not everyone will be Erica, just to be totally candid. Not everyone will be as well received. Not everybody will win their discrimination case, right? Not everybody will experience success in the way that, at least starting out, we may think we know what success looks like, and we may not achieve that success. That's not to say we won't be successful in other respects and we won't have achieved other forms of change, but not every instance of speaking up is going to end the way that we would want. And that is really scary. And it's also something that we have to just be comfortable with. We have to talk about it with each other. We have to normalize talking about, I don't even really want to call it failure, because I don't think it's failure to speak up and not achieve the result that you wanted, but we have to talk about what might be conventionally considered failure or our efforts that didn't turn out in the way we had hoped, because otherwise we're only putting out into the world, the choices that we're proud of, the op-eds that were published, the jobs that we got, the time that we did move to an integrated neighborhood and we felt really good about ourselves. And we're not talking about all the things we didn't do or we didn't succeed, or in retrospect, we don't think we made the right choice. And that's what will help people, I think, on that journey to be comfortable with the fact that, it's not going to be a linear journey. It certainly hasn't been a linear journey for our country, but it's not going to be a linear journey within ourselves either. And we have to be comfortable with that kind of iterative process where we're going to take 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. And that's okay. That's part of how we're going to get there.
So we're going to move into Q&A now, and we have some questions already. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box. The first one I think applies to all 3 of you, so feel free to jump in and answer. But it's around the I think the impact of your voice. And so, as you've spoken up, as you have held companies accountable, has that been recognized in other opportunities in your life? Have you gotten those board opportunities or, spaces where companies really value that type of accountability, or has it not? What are the, I think that the question is really around, are there companies who are holding themselves and their power accountable and leveraging the work that you've done? Erica, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I think you see the bell curve, the spectrum of companies and cases, right? You see sort of a group of companies that are very committed to aligning themselves with their values and their mission, to paying attention to their stakeholders' needs, to their employers' needs. And this group of individuals will definitely put the right people on their board seats, put the right policies within their organizations to make sure that their employees are taken care of, really focus on what internally is going on in the organization. And are there any instances where their key initiatives aren't being pushed forward, and how do they change that, and how do they sort of resolve those issues? You definitely have those. I think Yael was talking about this as well. There are a group of people that, want to appear to have voices of dissent within their organization, but once those voices of dissent actually get embedded in the organization and tell them things that they don't want to hear, it's amazing how they will sort of construct and push out these people outside of their organization. So technically you work for them, but you have no decision-making power. Or there is the active effort to sort of silence the voices of those people who are in those organizations. And that is something that you're also seeing, and that you have to also be aware of in those contexts. So it's really difficult to say, where you'll fall on that spectrum. And I think, to Ria's point, again, accepting the fact that there are so many different dynamic pathways in which you can sort of come up against a conflict when you're trying to change the behavior and the outcomes that we're seeing within these companies. It can be quite variable. Yeah.
Yeah,
I'll take a very quick crack at this. I'm going to be more blunt than usual. I've been following the chat. I feel like this is just a pretty amazing group of women, and I'm not going to sugarcoat things for me right now. For me personally, and I've actually written a little bit about this, written some op-eds about this, about the risk people and where we are valued, especially in the private sector. In government, the risk people are the people that's your job, because your job is not to grow shareholder profit. Your job is to protect others. And so when you're in that world, sometimes that's in the nonprofit world, sometimes that's in public service, you're valued. But in the private sector, unfortunately, yes, there are companies who really want those. And when I say risk, I mean for any variety of risk professions, right? The ones who see around corners, the ones who are trying to protect the public, the ones who are trying to, make sure your product isn't creating harm, all of those things. I've always seen that value up to a certain point. And unfortunately, that point often is not sitting at the table next to the CEO or sitting on the actual corporate board. For me personally, I'll be very blunt. I am asked by some of the richest people in the world to have conversations because they think I'm so interesting, or they really want me to help them think more ethically about what they're doing. I will tell them my hourly rate, and they're like, oh, no, we just thought you would speak to us because, think of it as like really helping us. And I'm like, okay, so I still live in a small 1-bedroom apartment, and you are one of the richest people in the world, and I'm supposed to help you, but you don't value that. And it's sort of our whole system it is, as long as we remain a system where the truest role for a public company's board is to protect shareholder profits. It's very hard to really convince a company that all of these other risk factors is actually going to, in the long run, protect your profit. Some companies absolutely get it. And some companies hire very interesting people to their boards. But usually those people are still fit in a certain category, and they get a very big paycheck sometimes for being on those boards. And the people who are really going to challenge your thinking, your biases, your assumptions, and push you to possibly deviate from fast growth for a minute, I don't know. I know for me personally, and it's fine. I'm not seeking a $1 billion board role, but my point is, it is fascinating to me how many people will seek me out because they think I'm so interesting, but don't think I am financial, like they don't think that I deserve to be paid for being so interesting. And I think it's a dynamic that affects a lot of people. And it's one of the things I really think has to shift, but it's about what do we value in our society? And what do we value? Like, why are some of the things that are protecting people the most have to be funded by philanthropy, and things that just make our lives convenient are funded by venture? So there's so much to unpack within there, but I personally am less optimistic about where people are really valued in our different structures.
Rhea, do you want to weigh in on that? I feel like there's just so much that relates to the work that you do.
Yeah, there's a lot both that Erica and Yael have shared, and also a lot happening in the chat where clearly this is resonating with people. And I just want to pick up on one question I think that came in from Mary, which is, we're focusing a lot on the downside or the risk associated with speaking up, and the point is well taken. So why are we doing this again in the first place? And what kind of rewards have you received internally and externally? So I just wanted to flag Mary's question, which I thought was really excellent, and certainly begin to answer it, but others may have more to add. Even when and I talked about being unsuccessful, so I suppose I'm contributing to the focusing on the risk piece. When we think about internal rewards, I think we have to think about how we are going to sleep at night and how we're going to live with ourselves, knowing what we know and what we've seen, and are we going to stay silent or are we going to say something about it? And this is, one very small example compared to the bravery that my panelists have displayed. But, one of the probably the most high profile case I've been involved in is Masterpiece Cake Shop. This was the case of the gay couple that was turned away by a bakery when they sought to buy a cake for their wedding because of their sexual orientation. And, I represented Dave and Charlie, the couple, for years. And ultimately, we were unsuccessful in the United States Supreme Court, where the court gave the bakery a free pass for its discrimination against my clients, even as it generally upheld, non-discrimination laws as they apply to LGBT people. And that was deeply disappointing for them. And we knew that was a real outcome when the Supreme Court announced that it would take the case, because we had been successful in every court to that point. And so there had to be a reason that the court wanted to take another look. And that reason was probably not going to be, favorable for our clients. And, we did so many things along the way, it's hard to choose just one, but one that felt very personally risky for me was that I did at one point write an op-ed in the Washington Post about my own experience sort of having to come out in these day-to-day interactions. And one of the things that was so striking for Dave and Charlie is that, as LGBT people, when you go buy a coffee or you, park your car, you're not necessarily coming out as LGBT, but when you're planning your wedding, you can't hide who you are. And so it forces you to sort of come out over and over again in these situations where you're exposing yourself to discrimination. And the discrimination they experienced, though it was heartbreaking, of course, did not involve violence. It did not involve, threats to their lives, which is something that many more vulnerable LGBT people, and particularly, Black LGBT people, trans people, trans women of color, really do face those even more severe threats. And I felt very exposed, putting my own story in the pages of the Washington Post like that, information about myself I hadn't shared with anyone. I had my mom calling saying, I didn't know that some of this, and I did feel that I really was making myself vulnerable with the world. But I also felt that I had to do everything within my power to try and advance this cause that I believed in so deeply. And if we won, great. Maybe I might have wished that I didn't write this op-ed, but if we lost, I really felt so deeply that I had to know that I had left it all in the playing field, and that I had used every tool in my toolkit to try and persuade the court and the country that the discrimination that my clients experienced was wrong. And, in some ways, I don't know if this counts as a success or a failure, because we did lose the case, but it felt successful in the sense that we did move hearts and minds. We did raise public awareness about the issue. We did show people that discrimination is harmful and that it still happens. And that, to me, is what, hopefully will impact behavior and will mean that regardless of what the Supreme Court says, there's no law that says you have to discriminate. And so we can show businesses why they should do the right thing. And me telling my own story was a big part of that. And so, I count that as an internal reward, even though, by some measures, the external result was not successful.
Erica?
Yeah, Ria, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think there is numerous instances that you'll see that something that is initially perceived as maybe a failure is just part of the process of change. And we all have to remember that the impact in which we make and the legacy that you leave behind can far extend what those timestamps of the things that we've done, what the outcome of them were. And I think, there are so many cases that I can even cite. There's one of my favorite cases is Kathy Harris, who was a whistleblower for the borders of the U.S. Essentially, what they were finding were travelers were coming into the U.S. and being sexually assaulted, especially women of color, and there were no protections for these women because they weren't American citizens. There was no civil rights protections for them. And she had witnessed this behavior. She had tried to report it, but nothing was happening. So she went to the GAO and basically conducted a research study that was found that this was rampant behavior happening at all the borders. And because of this study, it implemented, the Civil Rights Act for travelers that come into the United States. And, she talks immensely about her story of the fact that it was very hard. It was very challenging. She was socially isolated and everything else. But from this point forward, now when, women who come into the United States, they have these protections that otherwise they wouldn't have. And I know like Snowden is quite controversial, but the fact that he did reveal this, now we have widespread encryption that happens all over the internet that is able to help us protect a lot of our really personal information that we weren't very aware of, the fact that everyone had such visibility into it without our consent. So, it can be very discouraging when you have these setbacks or these things that appear to be failures, but the impact of basically having the commitment to say, hey, these things need to change. I, like Rio was saying, I want to be able to sleep at night, I want to be able to come to a sort of threshold at the end of my life and say like, I did the right thing. I didn't maybe get the thing that I ultimately wanted, but, I can have that ability to sort of sit with myself and be comfortable. There's a lot of power in that. And I think that'll extend far beyond, maybe winning money or whatever else these other things are. So just trust sometimes that it is a process. Change is a process, and the time scale in which we want it to work by doesn't always come to fruition, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it hasn't left an impact and it won't institute changes in ways that potentially we can't even perceive.
Yeah, do you have a final thought? Yeah.
Sorry, I'm muted. Yeah, I am also I know we didn't get to all the questions, but I had also seen that one in the chat about sort of what are the positives. And I'm so glad like Ria pulled that one out. Listen, it's very clear that I've highlighted a lot of the challenges. I wouldn't keep doing what I'm doing if I didn't believe in the reasons behind why I'm doing it. It would have been very easy for me to sign that non-disparagement agreement and take the payout when I left Facebook. It would have been very easy for me to take some other roles that have come my way. At the end of the day, I would be lying if I didn't say there were frustrations, because there are moments where it's like, I am so exhausted. I am still screaming about certain things that I've been screaming about for years. It's exhausting when you're like, but the system hasn't changed. And then there's those moments where you realize that it has. You hear your own words coming through a lawmaker's mouth when they're talking about something, or somebody reaches out to you and doesn't just say you're interesting, I want to connect, but really says, I actually was so inspired by something you said, I chose to do X, Y, or Z. And there's no way to quantify that impact, but those are the moments that continue to push me to be who I am. And, I'll just end it with a friend once at a dinner party introduced me as the most optimistic person she knows. And I remember laughing, and I said, no one's ever called me optimistic because I'm always the one screaming about stuff. And she said, if you didn't believe that it was possible to change, you wouldn't keep fighting for that change. And that's like the most I'm so thankful for her for saying that about me, because it made me look at myself differently. There is so much reward at the end of the day in knowing that you were on what you consider to be the right side of history. That is going to be different for everybody. But I will always know that I believe that I'm on the right side of the things that I'm passionate about. And so that in and of itself is rewarding.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists today. This was an inspiring conversation. I hope that all of you are inspired to pursue the issues you care about, to stand up for others, and to use your power for good. I'm going to turn it back over to Amanda to close us out.
Okay, thank you, our panelists, Ria, Yael, Erica, and Christy, for such a great panel, great discussions, and talking about the hard topics that a lot of us can really empathize. And thank you for our attendees for participating in the discussions and your questions. If this conversation got you thinking about what needs to change in your lives, the best way to process that and make a plan of action is to actually attend one of our roundtables. We have one this Thursday afternoon or Friday morning. Through prioritizing and initiating our conversations like the one we just had, we can share ideas on how to rebuild the equitable world we deserve. And because through collective action, you can help shape businesses to be more inclusive. Remember, throughout the week, we're hosting at least one feature session each day, so mark your calendars, invite your friends to attend, and let us know your favorite parts on social media using #MobilizeWomen. Special thanks to our sponsors, RBC Wealth Management, Accenture, Guardian Life, Verizon, Bunge, BakerHostetler, Diageo, Lincoln Financial Network, Robinson+Cole, Amalgamated Bank, Key for Women, Cornell MBA, Encourage Coaching, National Grid, Lannick, and Mutual of Omaha. We greatly appreciate your support. Our next sessions are our program roundtables this afternoon at 1 p.m. EST. So the topics we'll be discussing are advocating for change, compassionate leadership, defining your mission and values, and navigating conflict at work and disrupting the status quo. A lot of relevant topics for what we just discussed from this session. So thank you again for attending, engaging, and taking the next step to rebuild the equitable world we deserve. Hope to see you at another session this afternoon or tomorrow.
Bye, everyone. Thanks so much.